My dearest YouTube family, how are you all? Today, I'm speaking to you with a very heavy heart. This is one of the hardest things I've ever had to say. Beyond Color Stories is not just a channel for me. It's a piece of my soul, my passion, my connection with all of you. I never imagined a day would come when I would have to step away even for a moment. But life has its own way of testing us. And today, I find myself at a crossroads. Last night, while recording a voiceover, I felt a deep pain in my heart. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was nothing. But as the pain grew stronger, I knew something wasn't right. I went for a checkup, and the test results shook me to my core. There's a problem with my heart. The doctor has strictly advised me to rest, to take a step back and focus on my health. And as much as it pains me to say this, I have no choice but to take a break from YouTube. It breaks my heart to be away from you all, to not be able to tell you the stories the way I always have. But I know one thing: health is everything. And if I don't take care of myself now, I won't be able to give you my best in the future. But please, don't think of this as a goodbye. I promise you, I will do everything in my power to come back stronger. I will try my best to share at least 2 stories in my own voice every month. And until then, my dear brother, Mr. James, will be here to keep this journey alive. He will narrate my stories, and I assure you, he will pour the same love and emotion into them as I would. All I ask from you is your prayers. Please pray that I recover soon, that I return to you all, stronger than before. Your love and support mean everything to me, and I can't wait for the day when I can once again share my stories with you the way I always have. Until then, take care of yourselves, keep listening, and never forget, I will always be with you no matter what. Over to James.
Hello everyone, I'm James. Today, I stand before you with a heart full of responsibility and determination. I am accepting this challenge, not just as a duty, but as a promise to all of you. I know that the standard you are used to is incredibly high, and I understand how much these stories mean to you. But I give you my word, I will not let you down. I will pour my heart into every word, every emotion, just as you have always felt before. These stories will not just be stories, they will touch your soul, make you feel every emotion deeply, and keep the magic alive. Trust me, believe in me, and please continue to support me. Together, we will keep this journey going with the same love and passion. So, without further delay, let's begin. CEO thinks she's a prostitute, punishes her, then discovers she's a virgin and falls obsessed. Welcome to our YouTube family. A very warm and heartfelt welcome to each and every one of you. I'm so grateful that you've joined me today for another blockbuster love story, one that will touch your soul, melt your heart, and take you on an unforgettable journey of emotions. Before we begin, I send beautiful and deep prayers your way. May your life be filled with endless love, happiness, and peace. May every dream you hold close to your heart come true, and may you always be surrounded by warmth, joy, and success. Whatever struggles you are facing, may they turn into blessings, and may love find its way into your life in the most magical way. Now tell me, where are you listening to this story from? I'd love to know. Share it in the comments below because this story is truly special. It's a tale that will touch your heart, stir your soul, and leave you lost in deep emotions. And my dear listeners, I need your support. If you love these stories and want to hear more, please subscribe to the channel and be a part of this beautiful journey with me. And don't forget to give your feedback in the comments. Your words inspire me, motivate me, and give me the energy to write even more breathtaking tales for you. Every comment, every like, and every share means the world to me. So now let's not wait any longer. let's dive into today's story. Get ready to feel every emotion, every heartbeat, and every moment of passion and love. Here we go. Windows reflecting the moonlight onto the pristine marble floors. Miller Lancaster stood at the bar, his fingers wrapped tightly around a crystal glass filled with whiskey. His sharp blue eyes darkened with a mix of exhaustion and contempt. The ruthless billionaire CEO, known for his cold heart and unshakable business empire, had just closed one of the biggest deals of his career, a deal that had cost him months of strategy, relentless negotiations, and a war against competitors who sought to see him fail. But Miller never failed. He crushed his enemies, dominated every battlefield, and walked away with victory, as he always did. Yet tonight there was no sense of celebration in his chest, no satisfaction from his triumph. His world had long become a mechanical game of power, control, and calculated moves, leaving no room for distractions like love or emotion. He had convinced himself long ago that women were nothing but deceivers, beautiful facades hiding nothing but greed, using their allure to manipulate men, to take, to destroy. He had seen it firsthand, growing up watching his mother leave his father for a richer man, witnessed countless women throwing themselves at him, whispering sweet lies in his ear while secretly eyeing his wealth. His belief in love had died long before he built his empire, leaving behind only the man he had become, ruthless, untouchable, and unwilling to be played. But tonight, unbeknownst to him, a dangerous game was about to begin. A game he hadn't prepared for, a game that would shatter everything he thought he knew. His enemies had been growing desperate, knowing they couldn't take him down in business, so they had turned to something dirtier: distraction, deception, and scandal. His closest rival, Lucas Crane, had orchestrated the perfect trap, arranging for a high-end escort to be sent to Miller's suite under the guise of a celebration gift, knowing Miller's hatred for such women would ignite his temper. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. The girl who walked into his suite that night was not the woman meant to be there. Mona Carter had never stepped into a world like this before. She was a simple girl, innocent in every sense of the word, breathtakingly beautiful in a way that didn't need embellishment. Long, wavy brown hair cascading down her delicate shoulders, eyes as pure as morning dew, lips that held a natural pout of sweetness, and a body that radiated untouched elegance. She was the kind of beauty that made people look twice, not because of heavy makeup or revealing dresses, but because of the quiet grace she carried. But tonight, that grace was nowhere to be found. She was terrified, confused, and trembling as she stood inside the intimidating suite, her heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't planned to be here. It had all happened so fast. One moment she was outside the hotel waiting for a friend who had asked her to pick up something from the lobby, and the next, she had been pushed into an elevator by two unfamiliar men, their expressions indifferent as they told her, "Just do your job and don't anger him." Before she could process their words, the doors had shut, and she had been whisked to the penthouse floor. The panic had set in only when she was forced into the suite, the door locking behind her. She had tried to protest, to explain that there was a mistake, but no one had listened. And now, standing in front of a man she didn't know, in a place she didn't belong, she felt her entire world slipping into chaos. Miller turned slowly, his gaze landing on her like a predator sizing up its prey, his jaw tightening as he took in her appearance. His fury was immediate. So this was their plan: send him a woman, hoping to catch him in some scandalous affair, hoping he would lose control, give in to temptation, and wake up to blackmail and ruined reputation. They must have thought him a fool. His lips curled into a smirk, but there was no humor in it, only cold, sharp-edged amusement laced with contempt. "So, this is what they're sending me now?" His voice was low, dangerous, filled with venomous distaste. Mona flinched, taking a step back, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. I I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her innocence was clear in the way she spoke, the way she held herself, but Miller was too blinded by his rage to see it. He prowled toward her, his towering frame making her feel impossibly small, his presence suffocating. "Don't bother playing innocent," he sneered, stopping just inches away from her. "You women are all the same. You think dressing up in silk and batting your lashes will make men weak, that we'll throw money at you for a few moments of pleasure." Mona's eyes widened in horror, shaking her head rapidly. "No, I swear I'm not—" "Save it," he cut her off, his voice turning colder. "I don't pay for women and I don't play games. You were sent here to tempt me, to trick me? Fine." His eyes darkened, something dangerous flickering in them. "Then I'll play along." Panic surged through Mona as his meaning registered. He thought she was here to seduce him. He thought she was— Her breath caught, a wave of fear crashing over her. "No, please, you don't understand. I'm not who you think I am," she pleaded, her voice breaking. But Miller only saw it as an act. How many times had he heard those words before? How many women had pretended to be different only to prove him right? He wasn't falling for it. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her closer, his grip firm yet not enough to hurt her. "Enough," he commanded, his tone final. "You came here for a reason, didn't you? To earn your pay?" His lips curled into a mocking smirk. "Then earn it." Mona's breath hitched, her body stiffening in terror. "No, please," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes, but Miller ignored the way her body trembled, the way she looked at him with sheer fear. He convinced himself it was all part of her act, but deep down, somewhere buried beneath his walls of cruelty, something felt off. She was too terrified, too lost, her reactions too raw. But his anger, his need to punish, was stronger than logic. He yanked her closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You walked into the wrong man's den, sweetheart, and now you'll learn what it means to play with fire." Mona's heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. Trapped, helpless, and unable to escape, she realized one terrifying truth. This man was going to ruin her. And no matter how much she begged, no matter how much she screamed, he wouldn't believe her. Tonight, her fate was sealed by a cruel twist of destiny. The air in the luxurious penthouse thickened with suffocating tension as Miller towered over Mona, his piercing blue eyes dark with unrelenting arrogance, his expression etched with icy cruelty. His sharp jaw tightened as he studied her trembling form, the soft glow of the chandeliers casting a golden hue over her delicate features. She looked so small, so fragile, standing before him with wide, frightened eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. But he refused to be fooled by her innocent act. To him, she was no different from the countless women who had tried to ensnare him with their beauty, their false innocence, their sweet words masking their true intentions. He had spent years hardening himself against deception, against the manipulations of women who thought they could wrap him around their fingers just because they had a pretty face. But he was Miller Lancaster, the ruthless CEO who bowed to no one, who allowed no one to play him for a fool. And tonight he had no patience for games. His lips curled into a cruel smirk, his gaze cold and unreadable as he took a deliberate step closer, his presence overwhelming. Mona flinched, her breath hitching as she instinctively took a step back, her back pressing against the smooth, unyielding surface of the glass wall. She was trapped, caged like a helpless bird, her heartbeat hammering violently against her ribs as fear clawed at her chest. "Please." "I don't belong here," she whispered, her voice shaking. But Miller only let out a low chuckle, devoid of humor, filled with nothing but bitter disdain. "Spare me the act," he drawled, his voice slow and mocking, his fingers wrapping around the edge of his cufflinks, adjusting them with practiced precision, as if her presence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. You women always know how to put on a show, but unfortunately for you, sweetheart, I've seen it all before, and I don't fall for cheap tricks." Mona shook her head rapidly, desperation bleeding into her features. "No, you don't understand. I was brought here by mistake. I'm not who you think I am." She tried again, her voice rising in panic, but Miller's patience was already worn thin. His eyes darkened, his jaw clenching as he leaned in ever so slightly, his breath ghosting over her trembling lips. "Enough," he bit out, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't tolerate liars, and I certainly don't tolerate gold diggers who think they can play me." A shiver ran down Mona's spine, her stomach twisting painfully at the sheer venom in his tone. She had never encountered someone so cruel, so merciless, someone who looked at her as if she were nothing but filth beneath his expensive shoes. Her body trembled uncontrollably as she tried to press herself further into the glass. But there was nowhere to go, no escape from the nightmare that had become her reality. She had walked into a trap she hadn't set, fallen into a pit she hadn't dug, and now she was at the mercy of a man who had none. "I swear I'm telling the truth," she choked out, tears spilling down her cheeks, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never done anything like this before. I don't even know why I'm here." But Miller was unmoved. He had heard every excuse, every lie spun so effortlessly by women who claimed innocence, who pretended to be different, only to prove they were all the same in the end. He had learned his lesson long ago. There was no such thing as innocence in a world driven by greed, and she was no exception. His lips curled into a slow, predatory smirk as he reached out, his fingers grazing the soft skin of her trembling jaw, tilting her face up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "You came to the wrong man to play your tricks," he murmured, his voice dangerously low, his touch deceptively gentle. "And tonight, you're going to pay for it." Mona's breath hitched, terror clawing at her throat as she shook her head frantically, her hands gripping his wrist in a weak attempt to push him away. "Please, please don't do this," she begged, her voice raw with desperation. But Miller only watched her with cruel amusement, his fingers tightening around her delicate chin. "Begging won't save you," he murmured, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction as he studied the tears streaking down her cheeks. "Women like you prey on men, don't you? You think you can bat your lashes, shed a few tears, and they'll fall at your feet. Not me, sweetheart. I don't fall." His words were like knives, each syllable cutting into her with merciless precision, leaving her breathless, shaking, drowning in helplessness. "I swear I'm not lying," she sobbed, her voice cracking. But he had already decided her fate. He wasn't going to let her leave, wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. She would learn what it meant to toy with a man like him. He would make her regret ever stepping into his world. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as Miller's grip on her tightened ever so slightly, his body heat radiating against her trembling form. She could feel the raw power he exuded, the dangerous aura of a man who was used to getting what he wanted, a man who had never been denied. And tonight, he wouldn't be denied. Her stomach twisted in fear, her mind racing for a way out, but she knew there was none. She was completely, utterly trapped, and Miller Lancaster was about to make sure she never forgot it. Miller's smirk deepened as he watched Mona tremble beneath his unyielding gaze, her delicate frame pressed against the cold glass wall, her breath ragged, her wide, terrified eyes shimmering with unfallen tears. The sight of her fear sent a dark thrill through his veins, feeding the twisted satisfaction that burned in his chest. He enjoyed watching her squirm, watching her struggle against the inevitable, knowing that she was utterly powerless under his control. His fingers traced along her jaw, deceptively gentle, yet firm enough to remind her who held the power here. She was at his mercy, and he wanted her to feel it, every bit of it. "You can drop the act now," he murmured, his voice dripping with cold amusement, his thumb grazing over her soft lips, feeling them tremble beneath his touch. "No one is here to save you. No one is coming to stop me, so why don't you make this easier for yourself?" His words sent a violent shiver down Mona's spine, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She felt suffocated, overwhelmed by the sheer force of his presence, the ruthless dominance in his eyes, the way he loomed over her like a predator who had finally caught his prey. "Please," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands weakly pushing against his solid chest. But he didn't budge. He was immovable, a fortress of power and arrogance, a man who had never been denied what he wanted. And right now, he wanted her submission. His grip tightened on her chin, forcing her to look up at him, forcing her to drown in the cold abyss of his gaze. "You're really committed to this innocent act, aren't you?" he mused, a dark chuckle rumbling from his chest. "I have to admit, you're good. The trembling, the tears, the way you look at me like you're terrified, it's almost convincing." His thumb pressed slightly harder against her bottom lip, his eyes narrowing as he studied her, searching for cracks in her facade. "But I know better." His voice was a dangerous whisper, filled with a cruel certainty that sent another wave of panic crashing through her. Mona shook her head frantically, her tears spilling freely now, her body trembling uncontrollably. "I swear, I'm not pretending. I'm not who you think I am," she sobbed, her hands grasping desperately at his wrist, but he only smirked, his grip unrelenting. "Lies," he breathed, his warm breath ghosting over her skin, sending an unwanted shiver down her spine. "You all lie. You all play the same game, thinking you can outsmart me, thinking you can fool me into believing you're something you're not." His hand trailed down the side of her face, his touch both gentle and cruel, his fingers brushing against the soft skin of her neck before gripping her shoulder with quiet possessiveness. "But I don't fall for illusions, sweetheart, and I don't let liars go unpunished." Mona's stomach twisted painfully, bile rising in her throat as his words settled into her bones, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't listening. No matter how much she pleaded, no matter how many tears she shed, he refused to believe her. In his eyes, she had already been condemned, already been judged as guilty without trial. And there was no escape from his verdict. "Please, please, just listen to me," she begged, her voice breaking, her fingers clutching at his sleeve like a desperate prisoner pleading for mercy. But Miller Lancaster was not a man who granted mercy. His eyes darkened, his patience fraying, his ego too large, too unyielding to entertain the possibility that he might be wrong. "Enough," he snapped, his fingers curling around her wrist, yanking her forward until she was flush against him, her small frame caged against his overpowering strength. "I've heard enough of your lies. Now, you'll learn what happens when you try to play me." A sob tore from Mona's throat as she struggled against his hold, her body writhing in helpless defiance. But he didn't let go. His grip was unbreakable, his dominance suffocating, his presence an inescapable force that consumed her whole. "You're so delicate," he murmured, his fingers brushing against the soft skin of her arm, feeling the way she trembled beneath his touch. "So fragile. It's almost a shame that you chose the wrong man to deceive." His words were laced with mock sympathy, his smirk never faltering, his gaze never softening. Mona's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling erratically as she fought against the panic threatening to consume her. "I'm not deceiving you," she whispered, her voice hoarse, her hands weakly pushing against him once more. But Miller only laughed, the sound rich with amusement, dark with arrogance. "Still clinging to your little act?" he mused, tilting his head as if genuinely intrigued. "I wonder, how long can you keep it up? How long before you break?" His words sent ice through her veins, a fresh wave of terror crashing over her as she realized the cruel game he was playing. He wanted to break her. He wanted to watch her shatter beneath his dominance, wanted to see her surrender, wanted to strip away every last piece of resistance until she was nothing but a puppet dancing to his tune. And the worst part, he enjoyed it. He enjoyed watching her squirm, enjoyed watching the fear flicker in her eyes, enjoyed the way she trembled beneath his touch. This wasn't just about punishing a woman he thought had deceived him, this was about power. And Miller Lancaster thrived on power. Mona's breaths came in short, uneven gasps, her mind racing for a way out, a way to make him listen, to make him see that she was telling the truth. But he was blind, too consumed by his own arrogance, too wrapped up in his own twisted beliefs to see beyond them. He had already decided what she was, and nothing she said would change his mind. Her heart ached with helplessness, her limbs growing weaker with each passing second. "Please," she tried one last time, her voice barely a whisper now, but Miller only smirked, his fingers tilting her chin up, so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "I don't believe in fairy tales," he murmured, his voice laced with quiet cruelty. "And I certainly don't believe in innocent little girls who claim they don't belong here." His thumb traced along her jawline, his touch deceptively gentle, a stark contrast to the coldness in his eyes. "So, Mona, how long will you keep up this charade?" Tears streaked down her cheeks, her body sagging in defeat as the realization settled in. He wouldn't stop, he wouldn't listen, he wouldn't believe her. No matter how much she fought, no matter how much she begged, he was convinced she was nothing more than a liar, a woman who had walked into his world with the intent to deceive. And now she was trapped, trapped in his dominance, trapped in a game she never asked to play, trapped with a man who held all the power. And Miller Lancaster had no intention of letting her go. Miller had never been a man to hesitate, never been a man to doubt his own decisions. He had built his empire on ruthless instincts, on unwavering certainty, on the absolute confidence that he was never wrong. Yet, in that single, shattering moment, as the undeniable truth unfolded before him, the unthinkable happened. He froze. The world around him seemed to blur, the sharp edges of his arrogance crumbling into dust as his breath caught in his throat. His body tensed, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it never had before. Disbelief clawed at his mind, refusing to accept the reality staring him in the face. But there was no denying it, no escaping it. Mona was a virgin. The realization struck him like a blade to the chest, slicing through the walls of his ironclad ego, leaving him reeling in its wake. His hands, once so sure, so unyielding, trembled slightly as they rested against her delicate skin, as if recoiling from the truth they had just uncovered. His heart pounded, his mind spinning in chaotic turmoil, his throat tightening with something foreign, something utterly unfamiliar. Regret. Cold, suffocating, unbearable regret. His grip loosened, his strength faltering as the weight of his mistake crashed down on him with crushing force. She hadn't been lying. She hadn't been deceiving him. She wasn't some gold-digging escort sent to manipulate him. She was innocent, completely, devastatingly innocent. And he had destroyed her. A sickening wave of guilt twisted in his gut, his breath growing uneven as his eyes locked onto hers. Mona lay beneath him, her face pale, her body trembling, her wide, tear-filled eyes staring up at him with a mixture of fear, shock, and unbearable pain. The same pain that now carved itself into his own chest, raw and unforgiving. She had told him, again and again she had pleaded, she had begged him to listen, to believe her, to see her for what she truly was. And he had refused. He had ignored every desperate word, every tear that had fallen from her eyes, every trembling protest that had spilled from her lips. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance, so consumed by his hatred, his distrust, his unwavering belief that all women were the same. And now, because of that blindness, he had wronged the one person who had never meant to deceive him. His stomach clenched, his pulse roaring in his ears as he struggled to process the weight of what he had done. He had been cruel to her, merciless. He had mocked her innocence, had treated her like nothing more than a pawn in a game of punishment that she had never deserved to be part of. He had taken one look at her and decided she was guilty, without evidence, without proof, without giving her the chance to defend herself. And now there was no taking it back, no undoing the damage he had caused. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him as he slowly pulled away, his body rigid, his hands curling into fists as if trying to hold back the storm of emotions crashing inside him. His mind screamed at him, demanding to know how he had let this happen, how he had allowed himself to become the very thing he had always sworn he would never be. He had always prided himself on control, on his ability to see through lies, to never be manipulated, to never let himself be vulnerable to deception. But he hadn't seen through the truth this time. He hadn't recognized innocence when it was right in front of him, crying, pleading, begging for mercy. And now he had hurt her in a way that could never be erased. His jaw clenched, his breath coming out uneven as his eyes roamed over her, her fragile form, her quivering lips, her silent, broken sobs. The sight of her now, so vulnerable, so defenseless, sent a fresh wave of shame crashing through him. He wanted to touch her, to reach for her, to fix what he had shattered. But for the first time in his life, he hesitated. Because he didn't deserve to touch her. Not after what he had done. Not after the way he had ruined her trust, her innocence, her very sense of safety. His fingers twitched at his sides, aching to wipe away the tears staining her cheeks, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Mona's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling erratically, her entire body stiff with shock. She wasn't looking at him, not really. Her gaze was distant, unfocused, as if she couldn't bear to acknowledge the man who had just crushed her world. The sight of her like that, broken, lost, sent a searing pain through Miller's chest, something deeper than guilt, something heavier than regret. He wanted to say something, to explain, to apologize, but no words could undo what he had done. Nothing he said could change the fact that he had failed her, that he had been so blinded by his own demons that he had destroyed the only thing in his life that had ever been truly pure. His throat tightened, his fists clenching at his sides as the full weight of his actions settled over him like a suffocating force. He had always believed himself to be above mistakes, above weakness, above guilt. But now, standing here, looking down at the girl he had just wronged in the worst possible way, he had never felt more like a monster. A deep silence stretched between them, heavy, unbearable. Miller wanted to break it, wanted to reach for her, wanted to do anything to erase the damage he had caused. But he knew he couldn't. The damage was done. The pain was real. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. He had never cared about a woman before, never allowed himself to feel anything beyond physical desire. But now, for the first time, he felt something more. Something raw, something agonizing. And it wasn't just guilt, it was something far worse. It was the horrifying realization that he had broken something precious, something he could never fix. He swallowed hard, his body stiff with tension, his mind racing for a way to make this right. But how could he? How could he ever make up for what he had done? He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that his actions had no consequences. But now, standing here, watching the pain flicker across Mona's face, he knew he had been wrong, devastatingly wrong. And now he would do anything to take it all back. His breath came out shakily, his chest constricting with emotions he didn't understand, emotions he didn't know how to handle. But one thing was clear. This moment had changed everything. It had shattered his beliefs, his certainty, his very sense of control. He had walked into this night believing he was the one in power, the one in control. But now, as he stood there, drowning in regret, he realized the truth. Mona was the one who had changed him, and nothing would ever be the same again. Miller had never known regret before, had never understood the suffocating grip of remorse. He had lived his life with absolute certainty, built his empire on the foundation of control, and never once questioned the weight of his own decisions. But now, as he stood in the dimly lit room, staring at the broken girl before him, something inside him shattered. It was a feeling foreign to him, something he had never experienced, never thought himself capable of. Pain. A deep, gnawing, soul-crushing pain that coiled around his chest and made it hard to breathe. Mona lay there, her fragile form trembling violently, her delicate hands clutching the sheets, as if they were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Her face was turned away from him, but he could still see the silent tears slipping down her cheeks, staining her skin with the evidence of her heartbreak. And it was his fault. His. The man who had prided himself on never feeling, never caring, never looking back. But now, for the first time in his life, he wanted to turn back time, to undo the unforgivable, to take away the pain he had inflicted upon the one person who had never deserved it. His breath hitched, his entire body frozen in place, as if moving would make the gravity of his actions even more unbearable. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words lodged in his throat, suffocating him in their absence. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry, that he hadn't known, that he had made a mistake? None of it would change what had happened. None of it would erase the betrayal written all over Mona's tear-streaked face. A deep, strangled breath left his lips as he took a hesitant step toward her, his hands twitching at his sides, aching to reach for her, to hold her, to somehow make this right. But the second he moved, she flinched. A small, barely noticeable movement, but it was enough. Enough to tear through him like a blade, to send a sharp, unbearable pain slicing through his chest. He had never known what it felt like to be hated. He had never cared enough to be affected by someone else's disgust. But now, standing here, watching Mona shrink away from him, watching the way her entire body recoiled as if his very presence was toxic, he felt it. He felt the sharp sting of rejection, of disgust, of loss. And for the first time, he hated himself. Don't touch me," Mona whispered, her voice so broken, so hollow, that it sent a fresh wave of agony crashing through him. Her shoulders shook, her breaths uneven, her small frame curled in on itself as if trying to disappear. She couldn't even look at him. She wouldn't. And that realization crushed him more than anything else. He had spent years convincing himself that emotions were weaknesses, that attachments were nothing more than shackles designed to break men like him. But now, as he stood here, drowning in the wreckage of his own mistake, he realized how wrong he had been. He wanted to touch her. God, he wanted to touch her, to hold her, to wipe away her tears, to somehow take back the damage he had done. But she wouldn't let him. She didn't trust him anymore. And why should she? He had been cruel to her, had treated her like nothing more than a pawn in his twisted game of punishment. He had ignored her pleas, her cries, her innocence. He had assumed the worst of her, had stripped her of her dignity, had stolen something precious from her, something that could never be returned. And now there was no undoing it, no fixing it, no taking it back. The weight of that truth crushed him, suffocated him, made it impossible to think. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, invincible. But now, standing here, staring at the broken girl before him, he had never felt weaker. "Mona," he whispered, his voice raw, strained, desperate. But she didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge him. She just lay there, trembling, silent tears slipping down her face, her breathing shallow, uneven. It was as if she had given up, as if the fight had been drained from her, leaving nothing but the shattered remnants of the girl she had once been. And he had done that to her. A lump formed in his throat, thick and suffocating, his hands clenching into fists as he struggled to keep himself from reaching for her. The urge was unbearable, the need to comfort her, to fix this, to erase the pain in her eyes. But he couldn't. He didn't have that right anymore. He had taken away her choice, had stolen her trust, had destroyed something sacred. And now all he could do was stand here, drowning in his own self-hatred, suffocating under the weight of his own actions. His chest ached, his pulse roaring in his ears, his mind screaming at him, demanding to know how he had let this happen, how he had let himself become the very thing he despised. He had always prided himself on being in control, on never making mistakes. But this was the biggest mistake of his life. And it was too late to fix it. Too late to undo the damage he had caused. Too late to change the way she looked at him now, with fear, with disgust, with heartbreak. His breath came out uneven, his hands shaking as he took another step back, as if physically distancing himself from her would somehow lessen the unbearable weight in his chest. But it didn't. Nothing could. He had hurt her. He had broken her. And now he had to live with that. A deep, suffocating silence stretched between them, heavy, unbearable. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg for her forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down he knew no apology would ever be enough. No words could ever erase the pain he had caused. And the worst part, he wasn't sure if he would ever forgive himself for it. He had thought himself incapable of feeling, incapable of love. But now, as he stood here, drowning in guilt, suffocating in remorse, he realized the truth. Mona had changed him, and nothing would ever be the same again. Miller had always been a man of control, a man who dictated every aspect of his life with ruthless precision. But for the first time, he felt utterly powerless. The weight of what he had done to Mona consumed him, an unrelenting force that gnawed at his soul, refusing to let him rest. He couldn't erase the image of her trembling body, her tear-filled eyes, the way she had recoiled from him as if he were a monster. And maybe he was. Maybe he had become the very thing he had sworn he would never be. But he couldn't accept that. He couldn't let it end this way. He needed to fix it. He needed to make it right. But more than that, he needed her. The realization struck him with the force of a hurricane, unraveling everything he thought he knew about himself. It wasn't just guilt that bound him to her. It was something far darker, far deeper. It was obsession, a hunger, a need so overpowering that it consumed his every thought. He couldn't let her go. He wouldn't. Even if she hated him, even if she wanted nothing to do with him, he would find a way to keep her, to make her his. Not just in his bed, not just as an object of desire, but as something far more. He wanted her heart, her soul, her love, and he would do anything to have it. The moment she had been taken from his suite, his orders had been clear. She was not to leave his sight. His security team had been dispatched immediately, surrounding her in an invisible cage. She would be watched, guarded, protected. No one would dare lay a hand on her, and no one would dare take her away from him. But she didn't see it as protection. When she awoke to find herself in one of his private estates, with guards stationed at every exit, she looked at him with the same fear, the same hatred. It tore through him, cut deeper than any wound he had ever suffered, but he couldn't let her go. She needed to understand. She needed to see that she belonged to him now, that nothing could change that. He stood before her, watching as she tried to push past his men, her fists pounding against their chests, her voice trembling with desperation. "Let me go," she screamed, her beautiful face twisted in anguish. But they did not move. They wouldn't. Not when the orders had come directly from him. His hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as he took slow, deliberate steps toward her. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low, unyielding. She spun around to face him, her eyes burning with fury. "You can't keep me here," she spat, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. But he only stared at her, his gaze unreadable. "Watch me." His words were like a vow, a promise that no matter how much she resisted, she would never escape him. He had done the unthinkable. He had crossed a line he could never undo, but he would not lose her. He would not let her slip away, no matter what it took. She hated him. He could see it in the way she refused to look at him for too long, in the way she kept her distance, as if being near him would taint her soul. It drove him mad. The cold, indifferent man he had once been was gone, replaced by something unrecognizable, something desperate. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't bear the thought of her looking at him with nothing but disgust. He needed more. He needed her to see him, to feel something for him other than fear and loathing. He had never begged for anything in his life, but he was willing to beg for her. He tried to speak to her, tried to offer her anything she wanted, but she met him with silence. The more she pulled away, the deeper his obsession grew. It wasn't enough to keep her here, to have her physically near him. He needed her to accept him, to forgive him, to want him. But how could she? How could she ever love the man who had shattered her? And yet, he couldn't stop himself. He had never known love, never desired it. But now it consumed him, twisted him, made him willing to do anything to claim her completely. "I will make this right," he told her one night, his voice thick with desperation as he cornered her in the dimly lit room. But she only stared at him, her eyes hollow, empty. "You can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And it was in that moment that he realized just how deeply he had broken her. The thought of losing her drove him to madness. His obsession turned into something unhinged, something dangerous. He would give her the world, shower her with wealth, with protection, with anything she desired. But none of it would matter if she didn't look at him the way he needed her to. He wanted her heart, her soul, her everything. And he wouldn't stop until he had it. He began to watch her more closely, memorizing every expression, every breath, every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. He needed to understand her, to know what it would take to make her his. He brought her gifts, the finest dresses, the rarest jewels, but she rejected them all. He cooked for her, something he had never done for another person in his life, but she refused to eat. Nothing he did seemed to matter. She was slipping further and further away, and it was driving him to the edge of insanity. His nights were restless, filled with dreams of her warmth, of her body against his, of her whispering his name with something other than hatred. He was unraveling, losing himself in her, in the need to possess her completely. And then, one night, he found himself standing outside her door, his fists clenched, his breathing uneven. He had never hesitated before, never questioned himself. But now, as he stood there, knowing she was just beyond that door, knowing that she was suffering because of him, something inside him twisted. He couldn't force her. He couldn't make her love him. But he also couldn't let her go. So he did the only thing he could. He stepped inside, his heart pounding, and whispered the words he never thought he would say. "Tell me how to fix this," he murmured, his voice raw, broken. She didn't answer, didn't look at him, but the way her breath hitched, the way her body tensed, told him everything. She was afraid, and it destroyed him. He had become obsessed with her, but for the first time, he wondered if he had already lost her forever. Mona's hands trembled as she shoved her few belongings into a small bag, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity, the air thick with fear and desperation. She had to get out. She had to escape. There was no other choice. Every moment she spent in this place, under Miller's watchful, obsessive gaze, felt like another piece of her soul being chipped away. She had seen the way he looked at her, the way his obsession burned through him like an uncontrollable fire. And she knew he would never willingly let her go. He had already made it clear that she belonged to him, but she refused to accept that. She had been a prisoner in his world long enough, and no matter how impossible it seemed, she was determined to break free. Quietly, she tiptoed towards the door, her breath hitching as she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting him to be standing there, watching her, ready to stop her. But for once, luck was on her side. The hallway was empty, the mansion eerily silent, as if even the walls were holding their breath, waiting to see if she would succeed. Her bare feet barely made a sound against the marble floor as she hurried down the grand staircase, her pulse racing with every step. The front entrance was heavily guarded. She knew that much, but she had overheard one of the maids mention a side door leading to the garden, a door that wasn't always locked. Praying that it was still open, she darted towards it, her heart slamming against her ribs with every step. Her fingers fumbled against the handle, and for a terrifying second she thought it was locked. But then, with a soft click, it gave way. Relief flooded her veins as she slipped outside, the cool night air wrapping around her like a whisper of freedom. She had done it. She was out. But she couldn't stop now. Not yet. Not until she was far, far away from him. With one last glance at the towering mansion behind her, she broke into a run, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she made her way toward the main road. The city lights flickered in the distance, calling to her like a beacon of hope. She had to reach the airport. If she could just get on a flight, put as much distance between them as possible, maybe, just maybe, she could start over. Forget everything. Forget him. The thought sent a sharp pain through her chest, but she ignored it. She had no choice. The memory of that night, of his touch, of the way he had broken her, still haunted her every waking moment. She couldn't live like this. She wouldn't. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived. A black car screeched to a halt in front of her, cutting off her path, and before she could react, strong arms wrapped around her from behind. A scream tore from her throat as she thrashed wildly, kicking and clawing, but it was useless. She was trapped. Panic surged through her as she recognized the familiar scent, the warmth of the body pressing against hers. Miller. "No," she gasped, struggling against his iron grip, but he held her firmly, his breath hot against her ear. "You thought you could run from me?" His voice was low, dangerous, but beneath the fury there was something else, something raw, desperate. He spun her around, his hands tightening around her wrists as he glared down at her, his eyes blazing with something dark and possessive. "You are mine, Mona," he growled, his voice rough with emotion. "You can never leave me." Her breath hitched at the intensity in his gaze, the sheer desperation lurking beneath the surface. For the first time she saw it, the cracks in his armor, the pain he was trying so hard to hide. But she couldn't let herself care. She couldn't afford to. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice shaking. His jaw clenched, his grip tightening. "Never." The word was final, absolute. He wasn't just claiming her, he was begging her to understand, to accept what he couldn't put into words. Tears burned her eyes as she shook her head, refusing to let herself be swayed. "You don't own me," she choked out, but even as she said the words, doubt crept into her heart. Because the truth was, a part of her had already been claimed. A part of her had already been marked by him, no matter how much she wanted to deny it. And that terrified her more than anything. Miller saw the hesitation flicker across her face, and something inside him snapped. Without another word, he scooped her up in his arms, ignoring her protests as he carried her back to the car. "Let me go," she screamed, pounding her fists against his chest, but he didn't flinch. His grip only tightened, as if he was afraid she would disappear the moment he loosened his hold. He climbed into the car, keeping her firmly in his lap as the doors locked around them. "Drive," he ordered, his voice a low command, and the car sped off into the night. Mona trembled against him, her body tense, her mind racing. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had been so close to freedom. But now she was back in his grasp, and this time she knew he wouldn't let her go so easily. "You don't get to run from me, Mona," he murmured against her hair, his voice almost tender but laced with a dangerous edge. "You belong to me." A shiver ran down her spine at his words, at the possessiveness in his tone. "You're insane," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He let out a dark chuckle, his fingers tracing a slow path down her arm. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I don't care. I need you, and I won't let you leave me." His confession sent a jolt through her, but she refused to believe it. He didn't love her. He couldn't. This wasn't love. This was obsession. And yet, as he held her against him, as his fingers trembled slightly against her skin, she felt something shift between them. She didn't know what it was, didn't know if it was fear or something far more dangerous. But one thing was certain. She was trapped. Not just in his arms, but in the storm that was Miller himself. And no matter how much she wanted to escape, some part of her knew she never truly would. Ruthlessness, crushing anyone who stood in his way, ensuring that no one could ever control or manipulate him. But now, for the first time in his life, he was afraid, not of losing money, power, or status, but of losing her, Mona, the girl he had wronged, the girl who made his cold heart beat for the first time, the girl who now looked at him with nothing but pain and fear in her eyes. He had spent days trying to soften her hatred, trying to make her see that he wasn't just a monster, that he could love, that he could change. But no matter what he did, she refused to forgive him. And then Lucas entered the picture. Lucas was Miller's greatest enemy, a rival businessman who had always wanted to destroy him. Their war had been waged in silence, in secret battles fought behind closed doors, hostile takeovers, stolen deals, backstabbing negotiations. But this time, Lucas had something more valuable than money or business deals. He had found Miller's weakness. He had found Mona. And for a man like Lucas, exploiting a weakness was second nature. He had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when he saw Mona's fear, her desperation, her longing to escape, he knew he had found the key to Miller's destruction. So, with a devil's charm and a vulture's patience, he made his move. It happened on a night when Mona had finally managed to be alone, away from Miller's suffocating presence. She had been pacing in the garden of his grand estate, staring at the iron gates that separated her from the rest of the world, her heart aching with the urge to run. That's when she saw him. A tall, handsome man leaning against a sleek black car just outside the gates, his piercing eyes watching her with interest. Lucas. She didn't know who he was, but there was something about him, an aura of power, of confidence, of danger. And yet, when he smiled, it was warm, inviting. "You look like a bird trapped in a golden cage," he murmured, his voice smooth as silk. "And I think I might be able to set you free." Mona's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't spoken to anyone outside of Miller's world in weeks. She had forgotten what it felt like to be addressed with something other than possessiveness, control, or obsession. This man was offering her something different. Freedom. "Who are you?" she asked hesitantly, stepping closer to the gate. Lucas tilted his head, studying her with amusement. "Someone who can help you escape," he said simply. "You don't belong to him, Mona. You don't belong in a world of chains and obsession. You're too beautiful, too pure to be wasted on a man like Miller." The way he said Miller's name made her pause. "You know him?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Lucas chuckled, his gaze darkening. "Oh, I know him very well, and I know exactly what he's done to you." Mona's stomach twisted. Did he really know? Did he know what Miller had taken from her? What he had turned her into? Shame burned through her, but at the same time, hope flickered. This man was offering her a way out. Could she trust him? Could she take his hand and finally be free? But something in his eyes made her hesitate. There was something hidden beneath that charming smile, something she couldn't quite place. "Why would you help me?" she whispered. Lucas's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something darker in his expression. "Because, Mona," he said softly, "I hate Miller. And taking you from him would be the greatest revenge I could ever have." The words hit her like ice. She took a step back, her mind spinning. Was she just a tool in a war between two powerful men? She had spent so long being trapped under Miller's control. Was she about to step into another man's trap? Lucas must have sensed her hesitation because he reached out a hand through the bars, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. "I can give you the life you deserve, Mona. Away from all of this. Away from him. Let me take you away." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to take his hand, to run far away and never look back. But deep in her heart, something held her back. Doubt, fear, and something else she didn't want to admit. A pull toward Miller that she couldn't explain. As much as she hated him, as much as she wanted to be free, she wasn't sure if she could truly leave him. And that realization scared her more than anything. Before she could respond, before she could make a choice, a voice shattered the night air. "Step away from her, Lucas." Mona's breath caught as she turned to see Miller standing just a few feet away, his eyes burning with a fury she had never seen before. His jaw was clenched, his fists tight at his sides, his entire body radiating a deadly rage. But beneath the anger, she saw something else. Panic, fear, desperation. He had seen her standing there, listening to Lucas's offer, and he knew he was about to lose her. And Miller never lost. Lucas smirked, leaning casually against the gate. "Ah, Miller," he said smoothly. "Didn't think I'd find you so careless, letting something so precious slip through your fingers." He turned his gaze back to Mona, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Did he tell you, Mona, that you're the only thing in this world he's ever truly cared about?" Mona froze. The words stung, not because she didn't believe them, but because some part of her wanted to believe them. But how could she, after everything he had done? Miller moved before she could react. In the blink of an eye, he was at the gate, his hand fisting the collar of Lucas's expensive suit, his voice a growl of barely controlled rage. "Stay the hell away from her." Lucas only laughed, completely unbothered by the threat. "Or what? You'll hurt me? Kill me?" He smirked. "Go ahead. But even if you get rid of me, the truth won't change. You don't deserve her, Miller. And you know it." Miller's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something close to pain. And Mona saw it, felt it. Lucas chuckled again, stepping back. "I'll be waiting, Mona. When you finally realize that he'll never change, you know where to find me." And with that, he walked away, disappearing into the night. Mona turned to Miller, her heart pounding. She needed answers. She needed to understand. But before she could speak, he reached for her, pulling her into his arms. "Don't listen to him," he murmured, his voice rough, desperate. "Don't ever think of leaving me." She should have pushed him away. She should have fought back. But instead, she stood frozen in his embrace, her heart waging a war against itself. Because for all the fear, all the pain, all the hatred, somewhere deep down, she knew. Miller wasn't just obsessed with her. He was falling in love. Miller had always been a man who controlled everything, the boardrooms, the billion-dollar deals, the world itself. But the moment he found out Lucas was after Mona, something inside him snapped. Obsession turned into a raging inferno, an all-consuming madness that burned through every inch of his being. He had already struggled to keep his emotions in check ever since the night he realized Mona's innocence. But this was different. No one would take her from him. No one. His mind spiraled into chaos as he imagined Lucas's hands touching her, his voice whispering promises of escape, his eyes filled with deceitful charm, trying to lure her away. He wouldn't allow it. He had already done too much to lose her now. His sins were carved into her soul, his darkness had tainted her innocence. But if there was one undeniable truth, it was that Mona belonged to him. Whether she hated him, feared him, or tried to run from him, it didn't matter. She was his to protect, his to keep, his to love. And if Lucas thought he could steal her away, he was about to learn who he was challenging. The moment Miller discovered that Lucas was hosting an elite gala, a grand affair filled with business moguls and celebrities, he knew exactly where his enemy would be. He had no patience for strategy, no time for subtlety. He was going to take Mona back. His jet-black car screeched to a stop in front of the extravagant ballroom, the golden chandeliers inside gleaming through the massive glass walls. Without hesitation, he stormed inside, his presence like a thunderstorm crashing through the room. The crowd parted instantly, whispers rippling through the sea of elites as Miller's furious aura suffocated the air. And then he saw her, Mona, dressed in an elegant silver gown that clung to her delicate figure, her soft brown eyes filled with uncertainty as she stood beside Lucas. The sight of her standing next to his enemy ignited something primal inside him. Lucas had dared to dress her up, parade her around like she was his. A cold smirk played on Lucas's lips as he raised a glass of champagne in greeting. "Miller," he drawled, "I was wondering when you'd show up." But Miller didn't care for words. His vision tunneled on her. Mona, the woman who had been haunting his every thought, the woman he needed. He strode forward, shoving past guests without a second glance, his large hand grabbing Mona's wrist with unyielding possession. She gasped, her eyes widening in shock, but he didn't give her time to protest. "You belong to me," he declared, his voice raw, trembling with barely contained emotion, his grip tightening as though he feared she would vanish. The room froze. Gasps echoed around them. Whispers of scandal erupted. Miller Kane, the ruthless CEO, the man who never showed emotions, was standing in the middle of a grand gala, declaring ownership over a woman. But he didn't care. Nothing else mattered except Mona. She stared at him, her lips parting in disbelief, confusion flickering in her gaze. Why do you care so much?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the stunned silence. Miller's heart pounded. Why? Why did he care? Because she was the only thing in his world that made sense anymore. Because every second without her felt like he was suffocating. Because he loved her. But the words wouldn't come. He couldn't say them. Not yet. Instead, he yanked her closer, his forehead nearly touching hers as his breath fanned against her skin. "Because you're mine, Mona." "Not anymore," Lucas interrupted, stepping forward with a smug smile, his confidence grating against Miller's already shattered control. "She came to me willingly," Miller snapped. His free hand clenched into a fist before swinging forward, his knuckles slamming into Lucas's jaw with a force that sent him crashing backward. Screams erupted. The music stopped. Security rushed forward, but no one dared to interfere between two of the most powerful men in the business world. Lucas groaned, wiping the blood from his lip as he chuckled darkly. "Touched a nerve, did I?" "You don't get to touch her," Miller seethed, his voice laced with deadly promise. He turned back to Mona, his grip gentler now but just as firm. "We're leaving." She hesitated. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to run or stay. Miller had hurt her, so much. But the way he looked at her now, the desperation in his touch, the unspoken emotions in his eyes, did he truly care? Lucas pushed himself up, his expression darkening. "You think you can force her to stay with you?" he taunted. "You think love is about possession?" Miller didn't blink. "I think love is about never letting go." And with that, he pulled Mona into his arms, carrying her away in front of the entire world. This war wasn't over, but Miller had already decided he would fight for her, no matter what it took. Miller had never needed to chase anything in his life. Power, wealth, control. They had all come to him effortlessly, bowing before his mere presence. But Mona was different. She wasn't something he could buy with money, nor could he force her to love him with sheer dominance. He had tried that, tried to keep her locked in his world, to possess her in the only way he knew how. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Now he wanted her heart. He wanted her to look at him with love instead of fear. He wanted her to stay, not because she had no choice, but because she wanted to. And so, for the first time in his cold, emotionless life, Miller changed. The ruthless CEO who had once believed love was a weakness now found himself desperate to prove to Mona that he wasn't the monster she thought he was. He started with small things. A soft knock instead of barging into her room, a quiet presence instead of overwhelming dominance. He gave her space even though it killed him to see the distance between them. He watched her from afar, memorizing every little thing that made her unique. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way she bit her lip when she was lost in thought, the way her doe-like eyes shimmered with emotions too vast to be contained. And then, he did something he had never done for anyone before. He apologized. One evening, as the golden hues of the sunset bathed the mansion in a soft glow, Miller found Mona standing by the balcony, her arms wrapped around herself, lost in thought. His heart ached at the sight, at the pain he had caused her. Taking a deep breath, he approached her, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Mona." She stiffened but didn't turn to face him. A part of her still feared him, and that realization shattered him. He took a step closer, then another, until he was right beside her. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. And then, in a voice rough with emotion, he whispered, "I'm sorry." Mona's breath hitched. She hadn't expected that. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find any trace of deceit. But there was none, only raw, unguarded honesty. Miller clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening into fists as he struggled to find the right words. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hurt you. I don't know how to fix it, but I swear to you, Mona, I'll spend the rest of my life trying." Mona's lips parted, but no words came. How was she supposed to believe him? How was she supposed to trust a man who had once treated her like nothing more than a possession? But then, he did something that completely shattered her defenses. He reached for her hand. But instead of pulling her to him, instead of forcing her into his world like he had before, he simply held it, gently, tenderly, as if she were something precious, something he was terrified of breaking again. Mona's heart skipped a beat. This was not the Miller she had met that fateful night. This was not the cold, ruthless CEO who had forced her into submission. This was a man who was trying, a man who was learning how to love. And for the first time, Mona saw it, the vulnerability in his eyes, the desperation, the silent plea for her to see the truth buried beneath the layers of arrogance and cruelty. He loved her, and no matter how much she tried to deny it, a part of her wanted to believe him. The days that followed were filled with surprises. Miller was different. He no longer barked orders at her, no longer treated her like something he owned. Instead, he courted her, like a man in love. He showered her with gifts, not just expensive jewelry and designer dresses, but things that held meaning. A first edition of her favorite book, a delicate bracelet with her initials engraved on it, a painting of the sunset, because he had noticed how much she loved watching it. He even cooked for her once, though it ended in disaster when he nearly burned the kitchen down. But Mona had laughed, and Miller had memorized that sound, wanting to hear it again and again. He learned her, studied her, loved her. And slowly, Mona's walls began to crack. She found herself noticing the way his eyes softened whenever he looked at her. the way his touch had become gentle instead of possessive. She caught herself lingering in his presence, her heart betraying her every time he was near. And one night, as they stood beneath the stars, Miller reached for her hand again, just like he had on the balcony. Only this time Mona didn't pull away. Instead, she let him hold her. And when he whispered, "Let me love you, Mona," she didn't say no, because maybe, just maybe, he already had. Mona had spent days trying to understand the whirlwind of emotions that tormented her heart. But no matter how much she tried to silence it, a truth was beginning to unfold. Miller was changing, and so was she. She had once despised him, feared him, wanted nothing but to escape from his ruthless grip. But now, whenever he was near, her heart no longer screamed in terror. It fluttered, hesitated, betrayed her. How could she possibly feel this way for the man who had once shattered her world? How could her heart betray her so cruelly, responding to his soft gazes, his hesitant touches, his desperate attempts to mend the damage he had done? She should have hated him. She should have pushed him away. But every time she looked into his stormy eyes, filled with unspoken regrets and emotions too intense to put into words, she felt herself sinking deeper into something dangerous, something undeniable, and it terrified her. One evening, as she stood by the garden, watching the sky turn into hues of pink and gold, she felt his presence behind her. He had been keeping his distance, careful not to push her, not to scare her, but she could feel his eyes on her always, burning with emotions he was too afraid to voice. "You've been avoiding me." His deep voice broke the silence, sending a shiver down her spine. Mona swallowed, her fingers tightening around the folds of her dress. She had been avoiding him, because every time she faced him, she felt herself weakening. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze, dark and unreadable. "I haven't," she whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. Miller stepped closer, cautiously, as if afraid she would run. "Then look at me," he murmured. She did, and that was her mistake. Because the moment her eyes locked with his, she felt the walls she had built so desperately begin to crumble. He was no longer the ruthless CEO who had stolen her innocence. He was no longer the man who had once made her tremble in fear. He was just Miller, a man who had lost himself in her, a man who was desperate to prove that he could love, a man who was waiting for her. And Mona's heart ached. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "Why are you trying so hard?" Miller exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "Because I can't lose you," he admitted, his voice raw. "Because I can't breathe without you. Because the moment I realized what I had done to you, I knew I could never forgive myself. But more than that, I knew I could never let you go." His confession shook her. Because it was real. Because it was filled with an honesty she wasn't prepared for. Her chest tightened. She wanted to deny it, wanted to tell him that it was too late, that he had already destroyed her. But then he took another step forward, gently reaching for her hand, his fingers trembling. Miller. Trembling. The same man who once believed emotions were a weakness. The same man who had once treated her like nothing more than a possession. He was trembling for her, and Mona felt something inside her snap. She tried to fight it, tried to ignore the way her skin burned where he touched her. But it was useless, because the truth was she was already falling. Against her will, against her mind, but not against her heart. "Mona," Miller whispered, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, his touch unbearably soft. "Tell me you don't feel this. Tell me you don't feel me the way I feel you." Her breath hitched. She wanted to lie. She wanted to push him away. But she couldn't, because the truth was suffocating her. Because the more she denied it, the more it consumed her. Her voice faltered, uncertainty gripping her throat. But Miller didn't rush her. He simply held her, waiting. And in that moment, Mona realized that she was standing on the edge of something she could no longer escape. something that would change everything. She was falling in love with the man she once swore she would hate forever. Miller had never known fear until this moment, not the fear of losing a business empire, not the fear of failure, but the terrifying, gut-wrenching fear of losing her. Mona had become the very air he breathed, the pulse in his veins, the only warmth that could thaw the ice around his once ruthless heart. And tonight, as he stood before her, every wall he had ever built crumbled to dust. The lavish penthouse was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the scent of roses filling the air. Yet the only thing he could see, the only thing that mattered, was her. Mona. His Mona. She was standing near the balcony, her long, delicate fingers gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The city lights reflected in her wide, uncertain eyes, mirroring the storm of emotions within her. She was scared, and he understood why. He had been cruel to her. He had hurt her, broken her trust, stolen something from her that he could never give back. And yet, despite it all, he had fallen hopelessly, irreversibly, obsessively in love with her. A love so fierce it consumed him, a love so deep it terrified him. But there was no escaping it. Not for him, not for her, not anymore. Slowly, carefully, he stepped toward her, his breath uneven, his heart pounding in a way it never had before. This wasn't just desire. This wasn't just obsession. This was something infinitely more. Mona. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, yet she flinched as if he had struck her. His chest tightened. He had never begged for anything in his life, never once cared enough about someone to plead. But tonight, he would beg if he had to. "Look at me," he murmured, his fingers aching to touch her. But he held himself back. She had to come to him. She had to choose him. For a long moment, she didn't move. And then, slowly, hesitantly, she turned to face him. His breath caught. God, she was beautiful, not just in the way that made men lose their senses, but in a way that made him weak. Her beauty was in the way she wore her pain with quiet strength, in the way her innocence still clung to her, despite all he had done. And it broke him. He took another step forward, his voice shaking. "I know I don't deserve you. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo." His jaw clenched as he forced himself to say the words that had been clawing at his soul. "But I love you, Mona." The confession shattered the air between them. Silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Mona stared at him as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Neither could he. He had never said those words to anyone. Not once. Love had always been a weakness, a vulnerability he refused to succumb to. But with Mona, it was inevitable. "I don't just want you in my bed, Mona," he continued, stepping even closer, his voice raw, unguarded. "I want you in my life, forever." A strangled breath escaped her lips, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He could see the war inside her, the battle between logic and heart, between past and future. "Miller," she whispered, her voice trembling. He took her hands in his touch gentle, reverent, as if she were the most precious thing in the world, because she was. "I know you don't trust me," he admitted, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "And I don't blame you, but Mona, if there is even the smallest part of you that feels what I feel, don't fight it. Don't run from me." He swallowed hard, his pulse hammering. "Stay." Mona's breath hitched. He could see her struggling, see the walls she had desperately built around her heart begin to crack. And then she broke. With a quiet sob, she collapsed into his arms, her fingers clutching his shirt as if she were afraid he would disappear. Relief crashed over him like a tidal wave, his arms wrapping around her, holding her, cherishing her. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent, memorizing the way she felt against him. This wasn't just possession. This wasn't just a need to own her. This was love. And for the first time in his life, Miller knew he would do anything to protect it, to protect her. He pulled back just enough to cup her face, his eyes searching hers, his voice a whispered plea. "Tell me you'll stay." Mona's lips parted, her gaze filled with hesitation, with fear, but also with something else, something soft, something real. And then, finally, she whispered the one word that sealed both their fates. "Yes." Miller didn't hesitate. He claimed her lips, not with dominance, but with love. Deep, consuming, undeniable love. A love that neither of them could escape. A love that, from this moment forward, would bind them forever. The air between them was heavy, charged with something neither of them could fight any longer. A desire so deep, so all-consuming, that it left them breathless. But this time, it wasn't just about need. It was about love. Real, undeniable, soul-shattering love. Mona stood before Miller, her heart pounding, her pulse racing, but not from fear, from anticipation, from the overwhelming, intoxicating sensation of wanting him just as much as he wanted her. She had spent so long running, hiding from the emotions that had always been there, but now, in this moment, there was no more doubt, no more hesitation, no more walls. Only them. Miller could see it in her eyes, the acceptance, the silent surrender that made his breath hitch. His hands trembled as they reached for her, as if he couldn't quite believe this was real, that she was his. Not by force, not by obsession, but by her own choice. His fingers ghosted over her skin, and a shiver ran through her body, not from fear, but from longing. "Mona!" His voice was husky, thick with unspoken emotions. His thumb traced the curve of her jaw, his gaze searching hers, giving her a chance to stop, to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her lashes fluttering, her lips parting in the sweetest, most silent plea. And that was all it took. With a low groan, Miller crushed her against him, his lips claiming hers with a desperate kind of reverence, as if she were the only thing keeping him alive. And in a way, she was. Their kiss was slow, deep, a dance of tongues and soft moans, filled with every emotion they had never spoken aloud. He kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like he would never get enough, like he had spent his entire life searching for this. For her. Mona melted against him, her hands sliding up his chest, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pulled him closer. The sensation of his body against hers sent a delicious heat spiraling through her, igniting a fire so intense, so powerful, that she felt like she was burning from the inside out. She wanted him, all of him, and this time, she wasn't afraid. "Miller," she whispered against his lips, her breath warm, shaky. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. "Say it again," he murmured, his fingers sliding down her spine, memorizing every curve. "Say my name, Mona." She shivered, her lips brushing his as she obeyed. "Miller." A groan rumbled in his chest, and in the next breath, he was lifting her, carrying her to the massive bed that had once been a place of pain, but now it would be different. This time there was no force, no dominance, no cold arrogance, only love. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers as he hovered over her, his weight pressing her into the softness of the mattress. He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring every second, every sigh, every whispered plea. His hands explored her body with a tenderness that made her heart ache, his touch setting fire to her skin. He worshipped her, kissed every inch of her, made her feel cherished, made her feel loved. Mona gasped as his lips trailed down her neck, his breath hot, teasing. Every movement, every touch was deliberate, purposeful. He wasn't just taking her, he was making love to her. And she could feel it, in the way he murmured her name like a prayer, in the way he held her as if she were fragile, in the way his body moved with hers, slowly, deeply, as if he wanted to become a part of her. And maybe he already had. Maybe he always had been. The pleasure built between them, slow and unrelenting, pulling them under like a tidal wave. She clung to him, lost in the sensation, in the way he made her feel like the most precious thing in the world. And when they finally shattered together, when their bodies and souls intertwined in the most intimate way possible, she knew there was no going back, no more running, no more doubt. She loved him. With every broken, mended piece of her heart, she loved him. As they lay tangled in each other's arms, their breaths still heavy, their hearts still pounding in sync, Miller pulled her closer, pressing a lingering kiss to her forehead. His voice was hoarse, filled with emotion. "You're mine, Mona. Forever." And for the first time, she didn't resist. She didn't deny it. Instead, she whispered the words that changed everything. "And you're mine." A slow, satisfied smile spread across Miller's lips, and as he held her, as he whispered sweet promises against her skin, they both knew this was only the beginning. Miller had never known fear, never known uncertainty, never known the unbearable ache of needing someone so much that the very thought of losing them felt like suffocating in the depths of an ocean with no way to surface. But now, as he stood before Mona, holding the most exquisite diamond ring in his hand, his heart pounded like a war drum inside his chest. This was it. This was the moment that would define the rest of his life. The moment he would surrender himself completely, not as a ruthless CEO, not as a man who once controlled everything and everyone in his grasp, but as a man hopelessly, desperately, irreversibly in love. He had never thought he was capable of it, never believed in something as fragile and uncontrollable as emotions, but Mona had changed everything. She had transformed his cold, unfeeling existence into something bright, something filled with purpose. He had spent so long obsessed with her, protecting her, possessing her, needing her. But now it wasn't just obsession, it was devotion, an unbreakable, all-consuming love that burned through every fiber of his being, and he needed to make her his forever. The evening was nothing short of perfection. Miller had spared no effort in creating the most breathtaking proposal, ensuring every detail was as flawless as the woman who had stolen his heart. A private island, the sky painted in hues of soft pink and gold as the sun dipped into the horizon. A pathway of red rose petals leading to a candlelit pavilion overlooking the endless ocean. The scent of blooming jasmine filled the air, the gentle sound of waves crashing against the shore, creating a melody that matched the rhythm of his racing heart. And there, at the center of it all, stood Mona, his angel, his salvation, the woman who had tamed the beast within him. She looked ethereal, dressed in a flowing white gown that billowed around her like a dream, her hair cascading in soft waves, her doe-like eyes shimmering with a mixture of love and disbelief. She had no idea what was about to happen, no idea that this night was about to change her life forever. Taking a steadying breath, Miller dropped to one knee, the weight of the moment pressing down on him with an intensity that made his voice thick with emotion. Mona gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock as she watched the most powerful, untouchable man in the world kneel before her, not as a king demanding obedience, but as a man laying his heart bare at her feet. "Mona," he began, his voice deep, raw with sincerity. "From the moment you came into my life, everything changed. I was lost in darkness, consumed by power and control, believing that love was nothing but a weakness. But then you..." He exhaled shakily, his gaze locking onto hers, filled with an emotion so profound it made her breath hitch. "You became my light, my obsession, my everything. I tried to fight it, tried to deny what I felt for you, but there was no escaping it. I love you. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anything in this world. And I don't just want you, Mona. I need you. Forever." A single tear slipped down Mona's cheek, her lips trembling as she stared at the man who had once been her captor, the man she had feared, the man she had tried to run from. and the man she now loved more than life itself. "Miller," she whispered, her voice shaking, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. He reached for her hand, his grip firm, unwavering. "Marry me," he pleaded, his tone filled with a desperation that sent shivers down her spine. "Be my wife. Be mine in every way possible. Let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are the only thing that has ever mattered to me." Silence stretched between them, the world holding its breath as Mona's emotions swirled in a whirlwind of love, disbelief, and overwhelming happiness. And then, with a choked sob, she nodded. "Yes," she breathed, her voice breaking. "Yes, Miller, I'll marry you." A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face, his eyes darkening with a mixture of relief and possessive adoration. Without wasting another second, he slipped the diamond ring onto her finger, the perfect symbol of his eternal claim on her. And then, unable to hold back any longer, he surged to his feet, capturing her lips in a kiss so deep, so passionate, that it left them both gasping for air. It was a kiss filled with promises, with devotion, with the unshakable truth that she was his forever. The wedding was nothing short of a fairy tale. Miller ensured that Mona had everything she had ever dreamed of. A breathtaking cathedral adorned with thousands of white roses, a gown so exquisite it looked like it had been woven from moonlight, a ceremony filled with love and emotion. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on the man waiting for her at the altar, she realized something profound. Fate had always meant for them to be together. No matter how much she had fought it, no matter how much she had tried to deny it, Miller had always been hers. And now, as she took his hand, as they exchanged vows that bound them together for eternity, she knew without a doubt that she had made the right choice. Miller kissed her before the officiant even had the chance to say, "You may now kiss the bride," his impatience earning a round of laughter and cheers from their guests. But he didn't care. He had waited long enough. She was his, and he would spend the rest of his life worshiping her, loving her, protecting her. Their honeymoon was a dream. Weeks spent traveling the most beautiful places in the world, waking up in each other's arms, tangled in silken sheets, whispering promises of forever. Miller was no longer just the ruthless billionaire CEO. He was a man completely, hopelessly in love. He pampered Mona in every way possible, ensuring that she never wanted for anything. But most of all, he gave her his heart, his soul, his everything. And Mona, once an innocent girl trapped by fate, now held the heart of the most powerful man in the world. And he would never stop loving her. Even as years passed, as their love deepened, as their family grew with the arrival of their children, Miller's obsession never faded. If anything, it only grew stronger. Every day he looked at Mona with the same intense, unwavering adoration, as if she were still the girl he had fallen in love with. And to him, she always would be. She was his first love, his last love, his forever love, his wife, his queen, his everything. And no matter what, he would never let her go.